Well, let's talk about what it means to serve Christ in the academy. And I want to begin by telling you a little story. My life was greatly impacted by a young 44-year-old guy whose own life was tremendously transformed as a university student. He was a tall kid, good-looking when he was in college. He was a business and engineering management major in 1974, the same year I graduated from university. But he was a kid without direction. He had no real faith. His father had made it big in the construction business, and his mom flitted back and forth between New York and Paris and London on shopping trips. But he had no purpose. But he had one professor in 1974 that absolutely galvanized his attention and transformed his life. This professor's passionate devotion to the faith, his commitment to make a difference in the world, changed this young man's life. And he became deeply devoted to the faith, began reading what he could. He had a direction. He wanted to make a difference in the world. This rich young student found a purpose in life because of the influence of one professor. The university was the King Abdul Aziz University in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. The professor was Palestinian-born Islamic scholar Abdallah Azzam, and the student was Osama bin Laden. Now, I've often wondered, how might the world be different had Osama bin Laden's life been impacted by godly professors who were teaching business management and engineering from a Christian perspective, who were living out the love and lordship of Jesus Christ? How might the world be different today? One professor changing one student and changing the world. So what I'd like to do today is ask and answer, well, I'm going to ask 3 questions. I'll answer 2 of them, and we'll spend the network answering the 3rd one. Is our work in the academy significant? Because, as I've mentioned, there are some in the church who would say it is not. Second question, is our work in the academy ministry? Is it a service to God? And then the 3rd question that we'll be answering through the network, if our work is significant and if it is ministry, how do we serve Christ in the academy? So let's set about the first question. Is our work in the academy significant? I say there are 2 reasons, at least, why our work in the academy is significant. First, lives are transformed in the classroom. Now, this is our world, the classroom. But if you bring in, let's say, the normal Christian from one of our churches, and they walk down the hallway of our university or seminary, and they peer inside the classroom, they're not going to be very impressed, because they'll see students, some of them listening, some probably sleeping, nowadays some doodling on their computers, some's mind they're somewhere else. The classroom lacks the warmth of a home Bible study. It lacks the excitement of a Christian rock concert. It lacks the thrill of an evangelistic crusade. It lacks all the things that Christians normally seek in an event. But as you know, and as I know, don't be fooled. Lives are being transformed in that classroom. That's why we often hear it said, the university is the church of the secular society. The reason the university is the church of the secular society is because that is where the values are being formed. The classroom is one of the most strategic change points in the world. If you take the 3,000 square centimeters behind the university lectern, those 3,000 square centimeters are some of the most significant change points in the world, because it's from that place that the gatekeepers of a culture are being shaped. Worldviews are being transformed moment by moment in the classroom. There's a longitudinal study in the U.S. called the case study of university freshmen compared to university seniors over their university career. And one conclusion of that study has found that 50% of all the students who profess a Christian faith when they walk in as a freshman no longer profess their Christian faith when they finish the university. That proves university works, for better or for worse. So in no other place can you be so sure you're influencing leaders of a culture, of a nation, than in the university. So if we want human life to be transformed by Jesus Christ, then we must engage higher education. More than 90% of all world leaders are trained in university classrooms. So it's not optional for those of us who follow Jesus to be absent from the classroom of the universities and seminaries of the world. One of my heroes is Charles Malek. He was an Orthodox believer from Lebanon. He was actually a professor with one of my dear friends for many years at the American University in Beirut. Later became General Secretary and first President of the United Nations, and actually authored much of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but a fervent evangelical Orthodox believer. And he said this: the university is a clear-cut fulcrum with which to move the world. Change the university and you change the world. So we have a choice, because if we had time to review history, we can see that Reformation or revolution has often issued from the universities. Think about the early universities here in Europe. Oxford, Cambridge, others were founded as places to study the Bible, to study the Word. Of the first 115 universities in America, 110 of them were founded with a decidedly Christian worldview. Think about the great revivals and great Reformation movements that have sprung forth from universities. Think about John Wycliffe, John Huss, Martin Luther. John Wesley was an Oxford professor till the day he died. Think about the commitment of these university men and women to Reformation. Now, we're more familiar with the revolution side, because we've seen in our own world how revolutions have been spawned in the university. In fact, I was lecturing a while back in Beijing, and they gave me this nice booklet as a gift. I was lecturing on actually the founding of universities as a Christian institution, and when I left that day, they gave me this booklet, Peking University, and it's a nice glossy 4-color book showing how when I was on the flight home, I was reading, Peking University has a glorious revolutionary tradition. And it goes on to spell out how throughout the 20th century, Peking University has been the seedbed for communist revolution throughout China. And so that was one of their selling points. We are a center for revolution. And of course, unfortunately, other religions are often better at picking up on the change significance. I have some articles here, one from the Chronicle of Higher Education, listing all the millions of dollars that Muslims have been investing in universities to establish departments of Islamic studies. Here's an article out of a Wall Street Journal. Saudi billionaire gives $40 million for Islamic studies. So the fascists, cults, other religions have often understood, it seems better than we as believers, the crucial change that can come from universities and seminaries. In fact, another statement of Charles Malek's that I think is very critical. Christ, being the light of the world, his light must be brought to bear on the problem of the formation of the mind. The problem is not only to win souls, but to save minds. If you win the whole world and lose the mind of the world, you will soon discover you have not won the world. Indeed, it may turn out you have actually lost the world. And then he makes this famous statement that one of his books is titled Two Tasks. He says, responsible Christians face two tasks, that of saving the soul and that of saving the mind. So our challenge as believers, as academics, is to make sure that we are representing Christ faithfully in the university. I mean, even just think about the thousands of students that the Soviet Union brought to Moscow and other major universities to study during the Soviet period. Several years ago, my wife was teaching in Moscow in the early 90s, and one of her friends was teaching at the Moscow High Party School. It was where they trained some of the Communist Party leaders, and actually it was a real joy. Later on, we sponsored the first Christian lectures there on the resurrection at the High Party School. But her friend that was teaching at the High Party School asked her to come over because they had just opened up a new hall in that era of glasnost, and they had a huge bronze plaque in there honoring their most noted alumni. And as Terry and her friend Priscilla read the names of some of the most famous alumni, they read the names of Idi Amin, the butcher of Uganda, Saddam Hussein, the former dictator of Iraq, Fidel Castro. And you had to think, how might the world be different had those leaders been shaped by men and women who taught from a Christian worldview, who lived out the love and lordship of Christ? Their Marxist education worked. It worked. So we must remember, if you get discouraged in the classroom, you are changing lives. It's not dramatic. It's not dramatic like an evangelistic crusade or some sidewalk witnessing blitz, but you are changing lives in that classroom. That's why we often hear it said, the values being taught to students today will shape our world tomorrow. And so what you're teaching today has this long-term impact. And this is not a new issue. Last September, I was lecturing at a seminary in Lviv, Ukraine. And afterwards, Mark and Michael took me to see the beautiful historic part of Lviv. And they explained that when the Reformation came, thousands of Ukrainians responded to the Reformation. And there was a great revival. So in response, the Jesuits established a university. Well, Protestant parents wanted their children to have this good education, this European education. And so these Protestant families sent their children to the Jesuit seminary, and most of them, 4 years later, emerged not as evangelicals, not as Protestants. University works. Education changes lives. A second reason why our work is significant is ideas have consequences. Tragically, some Christians view education and ideas as having no importance. They forget that the souls we're called to save are shaped by the ideas they have accepted. So the ideas are like a map that determines how they think. I don't know if you've had a chance to read the book that Rick Peels has put on our recommended reading list for our network, Alex Rosenberg's The Atheist Reality, The Atheist Guide to Reality. Excellent book. I was reading on a flight over. Rosenberg said, physics is the whole truth about reality. We trust science as the only way to acquire knowledge. That is why we are so confident about atheism. The only causes in the universe are physical. Now, those are ideas. And those ideas have consequences. So the ideas we are presenting in the seminary and university classrooms have consequences. J. Gresham Machen, this is too big for a PowerPoint, and I apologize, but I wanted you to see this significant quote. On September 20, 1912, Machen was addressing the opening of the Princeton Seminary opening class, and he opened with these words: "What is today a matter of academic speculation begins tomorrow to move armies and pull down empires. In that second stage, it has gone too far to be combated. The time to stop it was when it was still a matter of impassioned debate. So as Christians, we should try to mold the thought of the world in such a way as to make the acceptance of Christianity something more than a logical absurdity." Ideas have consequences, and they have amplified consequences when they're being taught to leaders. Remember, 90% of all world leaders are taught in universities. And today, across Europe, there's a violent war of ideas and values and truth, a battle for the very soul of society. And it's being waged in the universities and seminaries of Europe. After the collapse of the Berlin Wall, a good friend of mine, Peter Kuzmic, the Pentecostal theologian from Croatia, said this: "In Eastern Europe, we're winning their hearts, but losing their minds." And now, 28 years after the wall came down, how is the evangelical church doing in education? Remember, Malek said, saving the soul and saving the mind. Ideas have consequences. Now, they have amplified consequences in a social context. I'm reading this book. It's 1,098 pages, and so it takes a little time. I paid my way through college teaching a speed reading course, but this one has taxed my ability. But Randall Collins, a sociologist at University of Pennsylvania, has written this fascinating book, The Sociology of Philosophies, a global theory of intellectual change. And he makes the case that the most important ideas that have shaped civilization come out of what he calls intellectual networks. Small groups of thinking people who germinate and refine ideas and then disseminate them as world-changing concepts. And he declares networks are the actors on the intellectual stage. And he says this: the history of philosophy is to a considerable extent the history of groups of friends, discussion partners, close-knit circles that have the characteristics of social movements. Now, when I say this, what groups do you think of? There are groups that immediately spring to mind. Do you think about, even though it wasn't academic, of course, but think about Jesus and his disciples. That was a small-knit group whose ideas changed the world. Think about Tolkien, Lewis, and the Inklings gathering weekly, sometimes twice a week for years. Think about Luther, Melanchthon, and their inner circle. Collins talks about the German idealism movement, and he reminds us that Schelling and Hegel and Fichte once lived together in the same house. So out of this social network, we had the whole German idealistic movement arise. Think about Socrates and his group, Plato and his group. Think about the Vienna Circle in the 1920s and 1930s. Think about the French existentialists in Paris in the 30s and 40s. In other words, thinking, he says, takes place in a social context. Thinking takes place in a social context. And I would challenge us as believers, each of us are in our own regions, but I would challenge us to gather, and some of you are already doing this, I know, but to gather with other like-minded passionate followers of Jesus in the academy and just spend time together, germinating ideas, saying, how does this make a difference? And out of your group impact, those ideas can be disseminated and make a difference. And that's why we need each other. I think that's one reason why this academic network can play a role in helping mobilize each one of us to connect with our colleagues in our city, in our university, in our country, in our region. What might God want to accomplish through evangelical scholars scattered across Europe? What might He want to accomplish through those of you who are teaching in universities and seminaries, where the future leaders of this continent are being shaped? So we see two reasons why our work is significant. Two reasons. Well, that doesn't mean, though, that it's ministry. Is our work, can we classify it as ministry? Is it service to God? I would like to propose a few reasons why it is ministry. And I would hope that we can embrace our work in the academy as ministry. Now, those of you in seminaries, it's a little more easy to do this, but I want all of us in the academy to realize this is ministry. Unfortunately, there's a growing trend, at least in the United States, of very vocal leaders who are saying there's only really 2 or 3 things that God really cares about, and that's preaching, church planting, and evangelism. And there are some very famous voices that I have great respect for, that this is pretty well, they actually say these things. That's all that God cares about. That leaves out a lot of significant work and a lot of significant ministry. Now, I don't know anyone who denigrates the importance of evangelism and church planting or preaching. Nobody I know says those things aren't important. The danger is, though, having this dualistic attitude that other tasks in the church are unimportant. So I'm partly responding to those kinds of voices that are saying work in the academy, scholarly work, is not important. I had a long and vigorous debate with one of the top mega churches in America that the work of the academy is strategic, and they were sure, but no, all that's important is evangelism and church planting. So I have an audience. I'm sure we're all in the same, singing off the same choir book, but just to reinforce and understand our thinking. First of all, the obvious, God created the mind. It was His idea, and He commands us to seek not only wisdom, which we're often reminded of in church, but we're commanded to seek knowledge as well. Think about Jesus commands us. We're commanded to love God with all of our heart and all of our soul and with all of our strength and with all of our mind. This was God's idea. And those of us in education just have the opportunity to specialize in loving God with our mind. Of course, all the commands, wise men store up knowledge, the discerning heart seeks knowledge, an intelligent mind acquires knowledge. It is the glory of God to conceal things, but the glory of kings is to search them out. A second reason is that Christ is supreme over the academy and over all disciplines and all professions. Another way to say this is the familiar, all truth is God's truth. And of course, the great Dutch reformer and as well as Prime Minister Abraham Kuyper, when he declared, in the entire expanse of the universe, there's not 1 square inch of the entire creation about which Jesus Christ does not cry out, "This is mine." He declares that not only about biblical studies, he declares it over biology. He declares his lordship not only over the church, but over education. He declares it not only over apologetics, but over physics. He's the Lord of art and He's the Lord of business. He's the Lord of gardening and He's the Lord of politics and the Lord of all these fields. He's supreme in every realm of living and learning. One of the best books that I can recommend is Mark Knoll's book, Jesus Christ and the life of the mind. And he quotes this Irish poet called Evangeline Patterson. I don't know much about Patterson, but this statement is very significant. She says, "I was brought up in a Christian movement where because God had to be given preeminence, nothing else was allowed to be important. I have broken through to the position that because God exists, everything else has significance." That is a full-orbed Christian worldview. A third point is that our research and our scholarship have eternal value. Now, in Isaiah 60, 61 and 66, you remember there are several references that our global God will incorporate the wealth of the nations into His eternal kingdom. Now, I haven't met anybody that really knows for sure what that means. I mean, Adam Smith took the expression for his great book on economics, but obviously it's much greater than simply economics. The best guess that I'm hearing is that in some way God is going to take the best of exploration and research in the arts and literature, painting, music, scientific discoveries, and in some way they will have enduring value and a place in His kingdom. And so our work in seeking out knowledge can have eternal value. But even more significantly, God has ordained that scholars play a strategic role in the expansion of His kingdom. There's a number of good examples in the Bible of scholarship playing an important role. I read a story, fascinating story recently, true story, about this kid over in the Middle East. He got captured by one of the many invading armies that marauding through that part of the world. As I recall, he was in his teens. He was a rich kid, privileged. His family was in the elite, in the ruling class. Handsome guy. So he had had a pretty sheltered life, and all of a sudden he's a prisoner of war. But when the military brought back these prisoners of war, somehow he and some of these buddies were chosen for this full scholarship, full paid scholarship to one of the top universities. And he was an incredible student, came out on top of all of his classes, all of his exams, stellar performance. And then he got a job, actually, even though he was a prisoner of war, he got a job in government after he finished grad school as an advisor to the head of state. And then he got another big break, and it was truly a God miracle that this happened. But the head of state appointed him as chancellor of the university. I mean, he's a foreigner of an enemy nation, and he's the chancellor of the university and later became prime minister. And all this happened in what's now Iraq. Now, his name, his birth name was Belteshazzar, but we know him better as Daniel. And so when you think about Daniel serving, and Matthew Henry says that chief of the wise men is equivalent to chancellor of the university, and it does seem to be the closest equivalent. You see this man of God that served God in the highest echelon of his nation and served Him well. Now, God, in His sovereignty, could have placed Daniel in any role in that Babylonian society. He could have put him anywhere. And where did He put him? He put him as chancellor of the university in education. Now, I'm still working on this one, but a friend of mine, a professor at Howard University in the U.S., Dean Trulier, he tells me that we can see the long-term influence of Daniel. And here's how he explains it. Evidently, Daniel did a full-scale curriculum reform at the University of Wise Men and installed a theistic, God-centered curriculum that was so thorough that the next time according to Dean, that we hear of scholars from this university is 603 years later, when 3 of the professors show up in Jerusalem looking for the one who is to be born King of the Jews. Now, like I say, I'm still putting some of those pieces together, but we can see that Daniel had a long-term influence. So God cares about education. Another example would be Paul. In Acts chapter 19, verses 8 through 10, you remember the story of how Paul, let me just read it. Paul entered the synagogue and spoke boldly there for 3 months, arguing persuasively about the kingdom of God. But, and if any of you have worked with churches, this has been a pretty common experience, the scripture says some of them became obstinate. I'm sure you've never seen that in your churches, but I've seen it some. They refused to believe and publicly maligned the way. So Paul left them, and where'd he go? He took the disciples with him and had discussions daily in the lecture hall. The Greek word is skola, our word for school, of Tyrannus, who, according to F.F. Bruce, must have been a converted teacher of rhetoric or philosophy. This went on for 2 years, so that all the Jews and Greeks who lived in the province of Asia heard the word of the Lord. So apparently, Tyrannus rented out his hall as a place of education. We might say it would be an embryonic university setting. It was a place where people came not for sermons, but they came for learning. And there's a gloss in the Western text of one of the early manuscripts that seems quite reliable, that Paul taught there from 11 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon, 5 hours a day during the lunch hour and the siesta. And then, of course, he made tents early morning and evening to pay his way. Paul did this for 2 years. Now, did everyone in Asia hear Paul's lectures? No, of course not. But Paul understood the multiplication impact, that when you're in a center of learning, which Ephesus was that, people went out and taught others who then taught others. And so consequently, he found several benefits. He found a more receptive audience than he found in the church setting. He found that he had more opportunities. The synagogue, he could basically teach once, maybe twice a week. There, he could teach several days a week. And he was teaching a broader audience. Both Jews and Greeks heard him in the lecture hall of Tyrannus, and he had a greater impact. But it goes beyond that. As you look at church history, you can see that God has used scholars throughout the history of the church. Think about Justin, think about Origen, think about the Irish monks. Now, with a name like McCarthy, you can understand why I'll mention the Irish monks. But you remember from about 560 to the 8th to 9th century, scores of Irish monks spread out from Ireland all across the United Kingdom, all across the European continent. And what were they doing? They were evangelizing and they were teaching. They developed education, and some of the schools that they started actually as elementary schools developed eventually to become leading universities. One of them lasted there at Gaul for 1,000 years as a major center for learning. So the Irish monks changed the history of Western civilization through simple evangelism and education combined. Education and missions are inextricably linked in the history of the development of Christianity of Europe. Richard Fletcher has this big, thick book called The Barbarian Conversion, fascinating book. And he makes it clear that all the way through the conversion of pagan Europe, that the production of books, he says, was inseparable from the work of Christian evangelization. So the scholarship and the evangelization was linked right on through. Think about the Nestorians in the 8th century. Now, there are some doctrinal aberrations that we're aware of, but they set this long missionary trail from Europe right across the Middle East, right across to Asia, including China. And wherever they went, they took educators and they took books. Everywhere they went, they were translating the gospel into the languages, culturally and linguistically, of those nations. Think about the Reformation. Within 10 years after Luther nailed his theses to the door of Wittenberg Church, Marburg University was established. So education was at the heart of the university, establishing it and carrying it forward. And then the Reformation led to the translation of the Bible all across Europe. My wife being a philologist, I hear about this all the time. And so what's the first book published in Lithuania? It was the Bible, of course. So what book shaped the Lithuanian language? The Bible, of course. What was the first book published in Latvian? The Bible. So what book shaped the Latvian language? The Bible. Just as we know the King James Version shaped the English language. So you have scholarship and the growth of the gospel inextricably linked right on through. So if we are serious about re-evangelizing Europe, then we as academics and the church must be serious about education. We must be serious about education at all levels. But beyond that, scholars are needed to translate the gospel into the culture of each generation and each culture. Andrew Walls says deep translation requires that active scholarship be engaged. And then just simply, we can bring glory to God in the academy. And I think C.S. Lewis said it best. You remember his little essay called Learning in Wartime? He says, we need some Christians to be well educated, to be able to meet the enemies of the gospel on their own ground, because our uneducated brethren have, under God, no defense but us against the intellectual attacks of the heathen. Good philosophy must exist, if for no other reason, because bad philosophy needs to be answered. The learned life, then, for some, is a duty. And probably most of us have felt both the joy of that learned life and the weight of that learned life. Robert Wufnow at Princeton says it well when he says, Christianity sacralizes, makes sacred the intellectual life. It gives the questions we struggle with in our work and in our lives a larger significance. That's why it's important that we embrace our academic work as a holy calling, as a significant ministry. You are in the full-time ministry. You're in a ministry every bit as significant as pastoring or evangelism or church planting. Embrace this holy calling that God has placed you in a place that complements, when well done, the work of evangelism and church planting and pastoring. So we declare by God's grace, I am God's minister in the seminary, in the classroom, in the university. How do we effectively serve Christ in the academy? Well, that's what we'll spend some time this week talking about. But let me close by quoting again Malek, and then I'll tell you a story. Charles Malek said, once a Christian realizes that Jesus Christ will find himself less at home on the campuses of the great universities in Europe and America than almost anywhere else, he will be profoundly disturbed. And he will inquire what can be done to recapture the great universities for Jesus Christ, the universities which would not have come into being in the first place without him. And he goes on to say, save the university and you save Western civilization and therewith the world. Well, let me tell you a little story and then we'll finish. In 1265, that's even before I was born, Marco Polo's father and uncle were guests of the Kublai Khan in Beijing. And the emperor was fascinated with their stories about their native land and about Christianity, according to Polo's journal. And one day, the Kublai Khan asked them, according to their journal, to bring back 100 wise men to teach them Christianity. And he told them, he said, if you will bring 100 wise men, if they convince me that Christianity is true, then I will convert to Christianity and my court and all of my empire. And of course, tragically, in those days, if the emperor converted, then everybody, they got converted one way or the other. Kind of like Piper talked about this morning. Willingly or unwillingly, they would convert. So Polo's father and uncle returned to Europe in 1269. And they did a recruiting blitz. They went all over, went to the church and tried to find dedicated teachers who would go back to China, academics who would teach and help convince the Kublai Khan of the truth of Christianity. They found, for all of their efforts, only 2 academics who would go, 2 Dominican monks, Friar Nicholas and Friar William, who agreed to go. And these guys were both well-educated in liberal arts, science, and theology. They were well qualified. So in 1271, the Polos, now young Marco was old enough to travel with his father and his uncle, they set out with these 2 monks, and they sailed across the Mediterranean to the port of Acre, and then one day into their journey from Acre across the great Silk Route, they got news of a conflict, a military conflict that had broken out in the area of Iraq. Yeah, there's been fighting going on in some places a long time. At that news, the monks turned and ran. They said, look, we were willing to leave our country. We were even willing to eat Chinese food. We were willing to do all this, but we're not willing to go through a military conflict. They turned back. Well, the trip takes 4 years. And so in 1275, the Polos arrived at the magnificent court of the Kublai Khan. And when they came in, they bowed in abject shame and embarrassment that out of all the resources of Christendom in Europe, out of all the wealth of knowledge and learning of the European church, they could not find one academic who would go to China to help convince the Kublai Khan of the truth of Christianity. Now, the tragedy of that is it was 100 more years before the gospel again reached China. 100 more years. And China was already at that time the most populous region of the world. So you contemplate the millions and millions of people who never had the opportunity simply because of the lack of willingness of Christian academics to teach in a place of critical need. Now today, it's no news for us. Europe is in crisis on several levels. It's hard to even make a list of the ways we're in crisis. God has placed you in one of the most strategic places of influence in Europe, in a university or seminary. I beg you, under God, recognize your work is a calling from God. It is a ministry. It is significant. It is life-changing. And with God's help, we can bring God's grace and God's truth to these halls of academe that are really some of the darkest in the world by God's help.